Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And if you are a regular viewer of the channel, you'll be aware of the detail Mark Turner delivers in his appearances. And today he turns his attention to the liberation of the various Nazi camps by US troops in 1945. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Paul, and good afternoon to all of your many stalwart viewers. It's great to be back with you again.
So we're going to dive straight in, Mark. I mean, as we were just talking before going live, we did a bit of content back in April and May about the liberation of camps, but your focus is kind of pull it all together and give it the narrative from that kind of US Army point of view of the discovery, the movement towards them, and so we'll bring up the slides, folks. As I said in the top of the show there, you know the kind of level of detail Mark brings. So I expect questions will be answered as we move through this, but if they're not, we will kind of deal with them at the end, I think, more than as we go along. But I'm gonna bring up the slides and hand it over to Mark, and he'll do his little preamble of his stating who he is. But I'm going to hand over to him. So over to you, the U.S. Army Holocaust Liberation Narratives.
All right, thank you so much, Paul. And again, it's great to be back with you again and with all of your many viewers. So thanks for having me, and hopefully this won't be the last time that I'm with you on the channel here. For today, of course, I got the standard disclaimer that I have to put out there. I'm still a federal employee for the time being. So what we'll discuss today, what I'm going to share, doesn't represent the official position of the U.S. Army or the U.S. Department of Defense. It's purely my own. I informed, I guess, positions on things, given extensive research, hopefully more than just opinions. And as I've said before on previous presentations, kind of my standard caveat, I suppose, at the beginning is that I am not a Holocaust expert. Hopefully we've got some Holocaust experts, people that have specialized, scholars and academics, others that have specialized in this topic. So I will get into quite a bit of detail, but please, if there are comments, if there are questions, please feel free to get those out there. We're basically learning together this afternoon, which is always really exciting. But I do hope to do this topic justice because it is such a difficult and challenging topic to continue to grapple with, even to this day, and more than 80 years after the liberation of the last camps in early May 1945. So again, it is a rather tough material. Obviously, you can feel free to leave at your own discretion. Again, if it does get a bit heavy, a bit dark, but I would encourage you to please try to come back. If you do take a bit of a break, and give the material a fair opportunity and a fair consideration. And again, what I'll try to do here as well throughout the presentation is to be as sort of sensitive as I can about the topic. Again, given that it is a quite challenging topic. So again, don't want to offend anybody. If I do, I'm sure that it will come up in the chat, and I will quickly recalibrate to get back on the straight and narrow path. All right, so I don't want to sort of box myself in, I think, to a particular time duration here, but Paul, I'm sure that you will tell me when we've gone on for more than long enough, and we'll cut it off whenever you and the audience
have a shave, Mark. We'll stop. Yeah.
yeah. But definitely, I think really the first 8 or so slides are more of an overview. And again, what I'm doing today is not an attempt to give you an in-depth sort of walk through the Holocaust all the way from 1933 to 45. So if anything, if we do shave some time off, it'll be in the first few slides here, which again is more of an overview, just providing a broad historical context, sort of what actually gets us to chronologically to the liberation of the first camps from a U.S. Army perspective, beginning on the 4th of April 1945. So a couple things that I do hope that we can get out of this presentation together. One is to think about leadership. So how various leaders, and of course what I'm doing here is focusing primarily at the tactical level of warfare. So how tactical leaders would address the liberation of the various camps, and of course coming upon death marches and all sorts of other horrors associated with the Holocaust. So we'll do that. Of course, we will also explore moral, ethical, and legal considerations. Of course, we already have the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention are already in place, at this time. And of course, as a result of the Holocaust, we'll have a lot more work done to international humanitarian law, again, in consonance with the Geneva Convention after the war. I will also talk a little bit about jus in bello, which, if you're familiar with the just war theory or tradition, you have jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus post bellum. So this is jus in bello, so it's just conduct, during war. So we'll talk a little bit about that, things like, proportionality, discrimination, restraint, topics like that. And so we will look a little bit at certain functional aspects as they apply to Holocaust liberation. So things specifically like intelligence, things like sustained medical support, force protection, things of that nature. A lot from a senior leader standpoint. I know you've had previous Holocaust episodes, Paul, that go at length into what Eisenhower knew and how he acted, or Montgomery, other very, very senior Allied leaders, George Marshall. But today we're really looking at, say, from private E1 level up to maybe about captain or major at the very, very highest. And doing that through primary sources, right? So looking at various primary source documents, most of which are from the time period. So you're actually getting the reaction of these soldiers, these GIs, if not on the day of liberation, within several days. There are a couple of post-war accounts as well, but mostly it's at the time. So we'll get a sense for what the reactions of these various GIs were like as best we can through the presentation today. And obviously, there's no way to try to even begin to replicate what these GIs experienced. And of course, you can extrapolate that out by 1,000,000% in terms of what those survivors of the camps were experiencing. But we'll get a little bit of a feel for it. I mean, through, again, images, through the emotional component by looking at the documents. Obviously, some things, again, we just can't replicate. The sounds, certainly the smells would be another sort of component that we can't replicate today. But I hope we can come away with a good sense for, again, what these GIs were experiencing as best we can, what they were feeling during the liberation of the camps. So I think that's about it for the first slide. And Paul, again, thank you for moving us along. So we're going to go ahead and get on to some of the key terms here. And I'll try not to go into too much depth. Again, I know you've done this in previous presentations, Paul, but just some really fundamental terms that we want to make sure that we understand before we start getting into the primary sources. Those include Holocaust. And I won't read the definition. I'm not going to go through reading each word verbatim on the slide, but you have Holocaust initially there. And all the definitions here are coming out of the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. First known use of Holocaust goes back to the 14th century. And of course, today, when we think of that term, we tend to associate that, again, with this period of 33 to 45 primarily. But it's not a new term. If you go back and look at the etymology, it goes back to the 14th century. And of course, when we talk about Holocaust, there are different types of or different components of the Holocaust that we're familiar with. So of course, we're looking at it primarily from a, say, Western European, North American standpoint. I'm sure if you're in the Soviet Union or any of the satellite states, you're seeing it perhaps from a different standpoint, a different perspective. When we think about the Holocaust, we're thinking about, again, the camps, the gas chambers. We're thinking about crematoria. So that will all be encapsulated or included in the presentation today. And of course, when you get into Holocaust as well, you're talking about everything from the Holocaust, by bullets. There are the gas fans, of course, the use of Zyklon B. So many different fats. It's just very, very difficult topic. And of course, this monumental event is going to involve a variety of victims and perpetrators, all kind of contingent upon where you are regionally. Of course, local dynamics, political dynamics, a whole bunch of things are going to come into play. So probably enough on Holocaust here. The next term is concentration camp. And again, we're pretty familiar with that term. And I think, again, Paul, in a previous episode, you had talked about tracing that back actually to the late 19th and early 20th century. So the term, we find it first used shortly before the Spanish-American War, 1897. Of course, we also see it used and applied during the Boer War in the early 1900s. There is perhaps some contention, some debate out there in terms of using it, say, with Native Americans. Of course, again, there are different camps in terms of whether this is the proper term to use with Native Americans. Same thing with Japanese Americans. Use the term internment camp or concentration camp, but they all mean roughly the same. Although, again, we do have, again, a lot of bags with the term that we connect to this 33 to 45 time period. So interestingly, there is a foreshadowing, again, as we relate to the term concentration camp. So we can go back and look at what the Imperial Germans were doing in German Southwest Africa. Of course, it's now called Namibia. But they were using concentration camps as part of the genocide of both the Herero and the Namakwa peoples in, again, what we call Namibia today. So again, a foreshadowing of what we're going to see a generation later, right, in the 30s and the early 40s. And moving on next to the term death or extermination camp. So in German, and forgive me, we probably have some German speakers out there, but in German it's Vernichtungslager is the term for extermination camp. And so, and we'll look at some specific examples of extermination camps versus vice concentration camps. They mean two very, very different things. There are a couple of instances of a few camps in the East and the general government, within what we would call Poland today, that are serving both roles. But again, it's a concentration camp where really the primary focus or function or goal of those camps is the systematic extermination of a large group of people, Jews and sadly many others as well. We see that's first used in 1944. And I guess this is probably as good a time as any to talk about this. So again, extermination camps, we're talking really about the four Aktion Reinhard camps. Those are Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Chełmno. And then there are two others that are also what we would call Poland today. Those are Auschwitz and Majdanek that are serving both in both capacities as both a concentration camp and a extermination camp. And then finally, we have the term genocide. So again, the deliberate systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. Again, this term goes back to the 43-44 time period. I think it's Raphael Lemkin, a Pole who manages to flee Western Europe. I guess actually that'd be Eastern Europe in time, who really coins this term genocide. And of course, again, this can be a highly contentious or debatable term. We see this applied to a variety, of instances since the Second World War. We see again these terms come up today when we're looking at, say, Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, Myanmar, other places as well. So, but it does have a very, very specific legal kind of connotation. So you can actually go to the United Nations and they actually have a specific, way of defining genocide. And of course, this also relates to individuals who might be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court for, say, gross human rights violations and committing genocide, that sort of thing, or fomenting genocide amongst a population. So that's the last term there. And I think that's it, Paul, for the for the key terms. So we'll move on here into some of the key events. A lot on the slide, much of which I will not talk about. This has been covered at length in other presentations, but just again giving you a sense for sort of this march, this descent sort of into increasing levels of horror and madness that well, sadly don't really begin formally with 33. We can go back and look at anti-Semitism in Western and Eastern Europe prior to that, but sort of formally, we have the creation, the establishment of the Dachau camp, the first permanent concentration camp near Munich in March of 1933. And really between that period, all the way up through, say, just prior to the Wannsee Conference in January of 42, I think it's safe to say that we could call this the period before the final solutions. The Germans would say die Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question, right? So again, sort of pre-final solution, but that doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't just horrific things going on throughout this time period. Alluded to the Holocaust, bullets that's happening, being conducted primarily by Mauthausen-Gusen and various Eastern European auxiliaries, beginning with the invasion of Poland into Operation Barbarossa. So that's happening. Then, of course, we have the Nazis sort of graduating, even while they're continuing to conduct the Holocaust by bullets. Then they're graduating to the use of these gas vans, sort of mobile killing vans in the 41-42 time period. And finally, we sort of scale up to this industrial sort of level means of extermination, of murder. And of course, it isn't to say that the Holocaust by bullets isn't very, very sort of impactful in terms of lives lost. I think it's about 2 million altogether are murdered during the Holocaust by bullets, and again these mobile gas vans. So a significant portion, right, of those lives lost in the Holocaust will be during that particular time period. Then of course we move forward. Wannsee Conference. I mean, that's where the sort of the coordination required to finalize the final solution comes into place, and then we kind of march on from there. So again, without getting into a whole bunch of detail here, you start off again with the first liberation of the camp is going to be Majdanek. And again, I see different dates out there. Some will say 23 July, some will say 24 July 44, but it's going to happen in the east, right? The Soviets are going to discover and liberate that camp first. Then, of course, we move through Auschwitz, as you can see here, beginning with the, and a great comment here about Jewish labor camps, okay? Excellent point as well. And also, it's worth, pointing out that, even the concentration camps, I mean, they are not germane or just localized to Germany itself, right?
Yep.
So we're going to see camps also in Greece. We're going to see them in Italy. We're going to see them in parts of France. So it's not, again, just localized to Germany. And that was a great comment. So yeah, we'll even see like forced labor camps in Tunisia as well. So yeah, we move forward. We get our first death camp that's going to happen, or pardon me, death march, forgive me. Death march, 18 January. That's a death march out of Auschwitz. And there are a number of very, very significant, death marches taking place in that the last, say, 4 or 5 months, the war, both in the East and the West. Then, of course, the Soviet troops will liberate Auschwitz, liberate the remaining prisoners that are there on the 27th of January. For U.S. troops, our first liberation activity or event will take place on the 4th of April with Ohrdruf, and we'll talk much more about that subsequently. And then finally, the last camp that will be liberated is Stutthof. That's the 9th of May, 1945. And again, we'll see here on the map momentarily where some of these places are located: Majdanek or Auschwitz, Ohrdruf, and then Stutthof. So aside from that, Paul, I think maybe I was going to mention briefly that if there is interest, with respect to the Wannsee conference, so there's a great movie out there called Conspiracy that came out in 2001 that I would definitely commend the viewers to take a look at if you haven't already seen it. So it's a pretty good treatment of that. Again, that's just horrific event that takes place. Okay, so we're moving on now to 4 slides worth of geographical orientation. All 4 of these maps, and many of you have probably seen them before. So these come courtesy of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'll get it out eventually. And the first one would be and this kind of works roughly in chronological order. So we begin with the immigration of the Jewish populace out of Germany between 1933 and 1940. And we're not going to get into a whole bunch of detail here. Suffice it to say that you do see very, very significant departures of individuals. So not roughly 90,000. They're leaving Germany for the U.S. and I guess we could also include Canada as well. Another 83,000 are moving to Central and South America. It's a little bit hard to read my own numbers there. I think it's probably in the 60,000 range. Yes, 60-ish, moving to Palestine. Of course, there's an inset there for Western Europe, and sadly, many of those individuals, over 100,000, that are going to go to Western Europe. It's almost like a frying pan into the fire sort of scenario, right? So if they can't manage to get out, by the time you've got the fall of the Low Countries and France, of course, it's going to be much worse for them. So they sort of escaped, the immediate, growing sort of, grasp of the Third Reich. But many of them will get caught up again in those deportations later on if they remain in the Low Countries or in France. And what else? So yeah, we also have a number, kind of maybe surprising to some. We've got about 15 to 18,000 that'll be fleeing to Shanghai or to China, and also a much smaller number that doesn't appear on the slide. But I was kind of surprised, again, a few years back looking into this. There also is a group of Jews who will flee to the Philippines, of all places. So yet again, kind of throwing pain into the fire, right? So I wouldn't say that I'm fond of giving the Imperial Japanese a lot of credit for the treatment of many of the individuals and the territories they occupy, but they, at least from what I've read about the Jews there's a Jewish enclave in Manila, they receive a little bit better treatment, if we can kind of say that, than say the Jews are going to be receiving under the Third Reich and the Nazis, say in Western or Eastern Europe. But still, it's not very good, right? It's still going to be a very traumatic and horrific experience for those individuals. Also, I wanted to mention that there's a population, before we begin to see the sort of the mass exodus, of the Jewish population from Germany itself. I guess we could also include Austria, the Sudetenland. There are about 500,000 Jews in Germany or in that area before the war. About half of them are going to manage to get out before, again, the final solution commences. And of course, sadly, there are stories of, say, the Brits. Of course, the U.S. would also fall into this category where we probably could have accepted a lot more. many more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, there's the story that we all know, right, about the MS, St. Louis that goes to the States, then back to Cuba, then returns to Europe. And of course, many of those individuals aren't going to survive the war. But yeah, so, and one thing and if anybody out there perhaps has this information or has a source to go to, as I was preparing for this morning, I was thinking it'd be really fascinating to see in sort of greater magnitude what the outflows of individuals would look like if we also include, say, the clergy or say communists. I mean, anyone that whose ideology or way of life isn't going to kind of comport or align with the way that the Nazis see the world. So yes, we have massive outflows of Jews, but also I think it'd be interesting to see who else is leaving, right? I mean, we got this. Yeah, I mean, just kind of this, is fascism sort of, degenerates and falls across Germany and then across the Third Reich. Kind of what other numbers could we also factor into that overall number? Individuals that are trying to flee and get out before essentially it's too late. Okay, so that was it on that chart, Paul. So moving on next to the major camps. Yeah, there are many, many thousands of facilities, for lack of a better term, that we would associate with the camp system. Transit camps, concentration camps, extermination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many, many thousands. But the Holocaust Memorial Museum has put together a chart to at least show you some of the major installations or facilities that we would associate with the camp system, right? And so they got a legend there in the lower right-hand corner that differentiates between the extermination camps and then the other camps as well. And this already came up with the mention of the camps in Tunisia. So we can see it's not just Germany proper, right? They are spread throughout the sort of the footprint of the of the Third Reich. And let's see. Yeah, probably enough on that to get a general orientation to the camp system there throughout Europe. Okay, so next chart, Paul.
Yep, we're on. Yep.
Okay, so here we've got the flows, the deportations that are happening from throughout southern, eastern, western. Did I see eastern already? I probably did. Europe into the various extermination camps, and of course we could also include, not depicted here, but the concentration camps as well. Oh, I also failed to mention on the preceding slide. So by early 1945, there will still be about 700,000 prisoners registered within the concentration camp system. And of course, you can imagine how much larger number that would be if many millions hadn't been exterminated by that point, right? So, but still, I mean, not too far from a million that would be in the camp system by early 45. So again, just showing you the various deportations. Much of this is going to be happening by rail. Of course, we could probably also include by foot, cars, but much of this by rail. And this is probably as good a place as any to just briefly talk about collaboration, without getting into a bunch of specifics here. But obviously, a lot of this is not going to happen without the willing, perhaps in some cases. So if you look at maybe like the Vichy government or the Ustasha in Croatia, or perhaps the Romanians, like the fascist regime there. So sort of willing collaborators. In some cases, maybe it's more coercive in nature, but it's going to take a lot of people, outside of just the kind of the SS, the RSHA, and others to actually enable this horror, this mass murder to occur. And I was just going to briefly mention here, if I may, one's actually, they're both pretty timely. So one, we just recently, if I can find the slide here, or the mention of it. So it's a movie, the Sorrow and the Pity, which came out in the late 60s, which really began to first sort of crack open or began to seriously investigate the role of, French people from across the spectrum. Not just sort of Vichy political sort of masters or the how do you say the milice? I think maybe is the right way to say that.
Milice,
so,
the milice,
yeah. So, but really groundbreaking work, and of course, as you might imagine, we start getting into issues of national myth and things like that. So, as I understand it, you could see the movie, and the man who actually produced the movie just passed away in the last couple of months here. So read about him in the New York Times obituary, but yeah. So it really wasn't until I think it was over 10 years before that movie actually appeared on French television. So I think it was 1981, which is kind of interesting. And then also another thing I just ran across recently about collaboration would be, goodness, trying to get the numbers to come up here. Here we go. All right, forgive me. Yeah, so another kind of recent example of just the extent of collaboration. So BBC and lots of other various news outlets reported about this, but looking at the BBC website here, so earlier this year, through the Dutch National Archives and the Huygens Institute, again, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that properly, but so they released basically the names of 425,000 people, Dutch, who were suspected of collaborating with the Nazis during the German occupation. And now the 425,000, about 150,000 actually face some type of form of punishment once the war concluded. See here that it's going to require a lot of collaboration to again enable these massive flows, of individuals into the camp system. Okay, is it there, Paul? And then moving on next to the liberation of the camps here. So let's see what to say about that. So really, again, we're going to focus mostly on the U.S. Army today. And we're just kind of working from north to south. I'll go ahead and identify some of the camps that are going to come from the discussion. So we'll talk about Verbelen, which again is up there in the north. Bergen-Belsen in the north is also going to receive some amount of discussion as well. We then begin to move more into west central Germany, talk about Buchenwald and Ohrdruf, and then down into the south with, of course, Dachau, and then also Gunskirchen, which is in Austria. Basically there to the east of Dachau. So we'll be looking at each of those. And also if you take a moment to focus on the legend in the upper right-hand corner, forgive me, of the map, you can identify which of the camps were being liberated by the U.S. primarily, or by perhaps the most appropriate term is Duke. I don't want to sort of artificially limit this to just say Brits and Canadians, right? There are many more other individuals serving in those forces. So Duke forces, and then of course you've got the white-blue block to represent or depict the camps that are being liberated by the Soviet Union. And so, I think that's probably enough to talk about there. All right. So just briefly looking here at how Holocaust liberation, or Army Holocaust liberation, forgive me, more specifically, has been dealt with in film, say over the course of the last I guess 45 years or so. Gosh, I'm getting old because I can remember seeing Big Red 1 in the theater. So yeah, okay. Not a young man anymore. But we have a couple of examples here. So many of you probably have seen one or multiple movies that are listed here. We don't have to get into a bunch of specifics. But, we see Big Red 1 with the liberation of Falkenau. That's in 1980. That comes out, of course, Band of Brothers with Kalifring Lager 4. And a little interesting bit of trivia there. It's actually the 12th Armored Division that discovers Kalifring Lager 4 the day before, as we see in Band of Brothers. Easy Company 506 and others arrive on the site there. And then the next three, for whatever reason, it would be interesting to talk to the directors or screenwriters about this, but we see a lot of heavy concentration on Dachau in Shutter Island with Martin Scorsese 2010, right? That's how the Liber, looking at Felix Sparks and the 157th Infantry Regiment, that's also Dachau. And then we had Lee, about Lee Miller, of course, Kate Winslet, serving in the role or acting in the role of Lee Miller, the famous journalist, model, war correspondent, photographer. So there are scenes in there that depict the liberation of Dachau that Lee Miller had participated in. I also want to mention just quickly here, again, just a shout out to some other films or documentaries you could take a look at. So if we go back to Big Red 1 for a second, and many of you probably have already seen this, but the Big Red 1 is considered to be semi-autobiographical in nature, basically looking at Samuel Fuller's experiences in the 1st Infantry Division from North Africa, all the way to the end of the war for his unit in Czechoslovakia. But if you get a chance, if you haven't seen it before, you can go to YouTube, and I think it's out there in both English and in French. But it was a French company that worked with Samuel Fuller in, I want to say it was 1988. In English, it's called The Impossible, or Vision of the Impossible. And what's fascinating about that is that Samuel Fuller actually receives a motion picture camera from his mother in the mail while he's serving overseas. And so the very first film that Samuel Fuller ever shoots in his very, very lengthy cinematic career. The very first film is the liberation of the Falkenau concentration camp on the 6th of May, 1945. So it is a just captivating, intriguing sort of, walk through his experiences. And so in this documentary, hour long, like I said, you can find it on YouTube. He basically is showing the vast majority of the film that he shot that day, the liberation of the camp, the burial of the dead there at Falkenau, his company commander, et cetera, but he's also narrating it as well. So you're getting kind of his reflections back to that time. I guess that would be about 40, 43 years prior. So very, very interesting and worth taking a look at if you haven't seen that before. And then, what else was I going to mention here? Let's see, before we move on. And then also there is, now I'm forgetting the name, the movie about Rudolf Höss, which came out, what was it, a year or two ago? Somebody will come to the rescue.
Yeah. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah. Zone of Interest. Zone of Interest. Yeah. It's all about Rudolf Höss, the last commandant of Auschwitz, and his family. And that sort of speaks to what Hannah Arendt calls the banality of evil. Just sort of how pedestrian and just how people that are seemingly sort of normal, I suppose, can go and commit the most evil and heinous acts imaginable. So again, 2 Academy Awards. If you haven't seen that, worth checking out.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've done all that, Paul, now we'll go into, as it says at the very bottom of the chart, how it actually happened, how it actually transpired. And so we're going to do this again through primary source documents. Now, if I was with students, I would have actually provided you a Microsoft Word document or a PDF ahead of time, where literally I had typed out every single word of all these primary source documents. I would have asked you to look at those documents as letters, reports at least a day or two in advance. So you could basically come to, say, a learning event session to the class and talk about your own interpretation, like a chance to reflect on this, like what's important to you, what really sort of strikes your interest, or really what kind of caught your attention as you read through the various texts. Unfortunately, we can't do that today. I would definitely encourage many of you, if you get a chance, to go back and maybe freeze the screen if you can. If you've got a bigger monitor, it might help. And you could actually go back and read these verbatim. But what I'll be doing today is just really reading from excerpts of these various primary source documents, if that sounds fair enough. And I wish we had more time to go through all of them. Although, again, Paul, he's grimacing right now. Like, we don't have 5 hours today, Mark. So let's keep it moving, right? So I'm just going to do some excerpts, and we will leave it at that. Okay, so kind of a standard format for a lot of these slides. We're going to begin by talking about the death marches first. And so where this particular document that you see on the left ties to is there in the lower right-hand portion of the slide. Get that little red bordered box. So it's happening somewhere. We can't say specifically exactly where, but it's somewhere in vicinity of Flossenburg, which of course is also is a concentration camp there as well. So these death marches, basically the text there lays it out. So we see that as the Allies are encroaching, getting closer and closer to the German frontier itself, and of course we could also expand that out to say Austria, the Sudetenland, those areas as well, Bohemia and Moravia. We can see that the Germans, and Paul, you discussed this when many scholars and authors on previous episodes, where sort of bizarrely, rather than husbanding all their resources and focusing on fighting the war, right? They're using all of these resources to try to retain as much of this slave labor as possible. So we see, again, in multiple instances, but again, this really begins first with Auschwitz on the 18th of January, 1945. But there are multiple examples in both the West and the East where death marches are taking place, right? So they're forcing thousands and thousands of prisoners out of camps, sort of bringing them back into areas that are still under German control for continued use, I suppose, and to an extent also extermination. But this will create compounding effects because now you've got camps, right, where say the normal capacity might have been 20,000, but now with death marches, now it goes to 60,000. So now you have issues with food, typhus, malnutrition, you name it. So, so that's. I
don't want to go down this massive rabbit hole, Mark, but that, to me, that doubling down the Nazis do on the ideology is as ridiculous as the whole concept in the first place, as it is evil, in that it's a luxury thing to do, in a sense, is get rid of people you don't like when there's an actual war to be won. And Hungary, I think, is the best example. They need to keep Hungary to protect them. Romania, they've got to protect the synthetic oil production, blah 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 blah. And yet in 44, when Hungarians, switch sides, they put extraordinary efforts into making sure they murder as many of Hungary's Jews as they possibly can, rather than actually putting effort. I mean, they are putting some effort into defending Hungary, but it makes no sense. It just makes no sense. And it angers me. I mean, all of it angers me, but it makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and not to sort of play the counterfactual out. And again, I'm sure that there are scholars out there that are watching or that will see this later that have looked into this extensively. But, I mean, even if maybe part of the predicate there is you assume you'll be able to sue for peace, right? But of course, at this stage, just there's too much water under the bridge to think that no, you'll be allowed to keep your. I think what did we say in early 45? It's 700,000. Camp prisoners are still alive. So to think that you'll be able to continue to use those resources, I mean, just sort of in peace or through some sort of negotiated settlement, it's just bizarre. And trying to apply any logic to it, it just defies any common sense. But yeah, these death marches. So of course and I don't know, maybe there's like a loose affiliation here where we'd say that the death marches also include trains. But many of them start out that way, and then of course you'll also have many death marches that either begin on trains and then they sort of devolve to movement by foot. Some start out on foot, but as you might suspect, there's if you think about say the death march out of Auschwitz beginning on the 18th of January, it's the depths of winter, right? So not enough clothing, not enough food. And of course, if you can't keep up, right, it's going to happen to you. So just just awful any way that you look at it. So there are a couple of really significant death marches that occur in the West. We've got one that begins out of Buchenwald on the 7th of April, another one on the 26th of April out of Dachau. But the one we're going to look at here is again basically in the vicinity of Flossenburg. And it's happening on the 23rd of April, 1945. So maybe you can see the date up there in the upper right-hand corner. And so, forgive me, I'm going to look at my Microsoft Word document here and my highlighted text. But this particular report here is being provided by a Corporal Harry Given, who was in headquarters battery of the 11th Armored Division at the time. And so they're going to come across. He and his colleagues are going to come across this death march as they're making their way across, so the sort of dwindling remnants of the Third Reich. So I'd like to just bring a couple of excerpts here to your attention for your consideration, and again maybe tie some of this back to issues of ethical and moral dilemmas, sort of anticipating various requirements. When you're given a gross human rights violation that's occurring or violations that are occurring, and we'll go from there. Okay, so the first excerpt that I have here, it's about maybe a third of the way down the slide here on the document. And so Corporal Givens begins talking about how at 11 a.m., again, we're talking about April the 23rd, 1945, at 11 a.m., our troops received a radio message from an artillery observation plane that German SS were massacring refugee slaves. But it was evident our guns couldn't register on the enemy due to the danger to the refugees themselves. And so we've got, again, a matter that ties back to, jus in bello, so just conduct in war. So yes, you can cite this death march. Again, of course, these observation planes can talk to the firing batteries, to a fire direction center, but you've got these SS personnel intermingled with these individuals that are on the death march. And so what do you do, right? And so here, if you're applying the criteria during just conduct of war of discrimination, right, you have to make that call. So as sad and tragic as it is, you make the decision to hold on trying to engage any targets within that death march because you don't want to kill a bunch of innocent individuals, non-combatants in the process. And then working a little bit further down the report here. So again. And this is a Corporal Given from the 11th Armored Division. He then talks about where, specifically in the text, he says, while the majority here we're talking about the prisoners to death marchers, while they had escaped slaughter or death, there remained still a larger number of wounded, and our medics heroically cared for those that they could without holding up our advance. So a couple of things I think that are really significant. So again, you've got this ethical, this moral dilemma. The war's not over. This is the 23rd of April, 1945. And of course, these GIs, they have no idea how much longer the war is going to last. They know that the end is probably near, but is it going to last a few more weeks? Are the Germans going to consolidate their forces down in what at the time is being called the National Redoubt and fight to the last, man, woman, and child? Who knows? And so again, how much medical support do you provide to these many hundreds, if not thousands, of death marchers, and how much medical support do you conserve? Because again, the war isn't over, and the advance has got to continue, and that's another aspect as well. So perhaps you triage and do the best you can to help perhaps some of those death marchers that are the worst injured, perhaps in the worst conditions, say from malnutrition. But the advance has got to continue, right? I mean, this is the sort of the spearhead of the advance, and so you're going to have to do what you can momentarily, but the advance has got to continue. You have to continue making your way further and further into Germany, because, of course, without destroying the Third Reich, without destroying the SS, the camp system, the Wehrmacht, right? These kinds of things are going to continue to occur elsewhere in Germany. So just, again, a difficult issue, right? In terms of how much medical support do you provide? How long do you stay there to provide aid before, again, you've got to move on and to rely upon subsequent echelons, following echelons within the armored division, or say from Corps or from Field Army or Army groups, to then hopefully come in and then do what they can to assist these very, very unfortunate souls. Okay, and then I think it's on the next slide here, Paul. Just continuing with Corporal Given's testimony, his report. So he also talks about, as they're encountering these death marchers, that many of these individuals are begging for the use of our rifles. And again, these are his words specifically, many begging for the use of our rifles. In one case, I saw 10 refugees standing around a German that they had just shot, and to make certain that he was going to stay dead, they proceeded to put additional shots into his already wounded body. With all this, while all this seemed somewhat unmerciful in itself, it was justified to the fullest extent. And I felt cheated to a certain extent that so few of these SS killers received the same treatment. So again, and I should have said this at the very beginning, if you're putting yourself on the shoes of Corporal Given or any of his comrades in arms within the 11th Armored Division, again, what do you do in that situation? So you have these, you've seen what's occurred, what these SS personnel have done or will do if left to their own devices to these death marchers. And so do you provide weapons, anything beyond, again, like sort of moral support, medical support? Are you actually going to provide them with weapons to then seek vengeance upon their various tormentors, the various perpetrators? So again, a challenging dilemma there. And we will take look at some examples later on in the slide deck where we can see how GIs are sort of enabling sort of extrajudicial justice to occur, and actively enabling, right, or somehow participating in the meting out of extrajudicial justice there within the camps, or again, as we see here with the death march. And I think there's one last piece here, Paul, that I was going to look at on that last the last slide with Corporal Given. So the last thing he says, and again, I wish we had the time. Please, if you get a chance, I mean, just some of this, the text here is just, it's difficult to read. And like when I go through a lot of this material, I get emotional just visualizing what these poor souls, look like. In fact, at one point, Corporal Given talks about seeing one of these death marchers with his jaw completely shot off, right? I mean, just unbelievable horror. But the last thing he says at the very end of that report, that it was typewritten on the 23rd of April, 1945, he can say that, or he says, I can only say that the entire sight of Monday afternoon, so again, this is Monday afternoon, 23 April 1945, provoked a renewed battle hatred of the Germans, and we are all now fully conscious of how brutal and savage these maniacs are. Let the Allied citizens take heed of these atrocities and deal the justified, hard blows at the peace table without the slightest complacency. And so he is already thinking about, I mean, accountability, of course, during the war. We discussed a moment ago with potentially handing off weapons to some of these death marchers, but then thinking about accountability, post-war. So that would be considered just jus post bellum. So, I mean, how is justice going to be carried out? And of course, we know we'll have a number of trials at Dachau and Buchenwald and Nuremberg and elsewhere, but he's already sort of foreseeing that this has got to be addressed, right? I mean, you can't just allow these kinds of things to occur, and then there's little to no accountability in the post-war time period. Okay, and then Paul, we can go on to the next slide there. Okay. Oh, if we can back up one, please.
Keep going up. Yep. Sorry.
Yeah. No worries. Yeah. So this was a bit of a segue. So you'd seen on the previous slide, if you were looking at the upper right-hand corner, you saw a group of German civilians from a town called Nammering, where they're digging graves for the victims of a train that had been moving from Buchenwald down to Dachau. And so that's the transition to the next slide, where you actually see a report of what had occurred there at Nammering. Of course, prior to these Germans then being forced to come out and to bury many of the dead. So I'll just talk a little bit about this report. So it is produced by the military intelligence team within the 5th Infantry Division. It's actually dated the 16th of May, 1945, because as you might imagine, many of these horrific atrocities don't come to light. The Allies, the U.S. Army isn't aware of many of these until after the war has concluded. So here it's about a week, I guess, or so after VE Day that this report is completed on the 16th of May, and it's by a First Lieutenant Robert Schoenfeld, who was the OIC of this particular MI team, military intelligence team, that is doing the initial investigation and then providing that to the G2, or the head or lead intelligence officer for the 5th Infantry Division. And so you might imagine how important this is to begin gathering all the evidence, talking to witnesses, getting all the testimony, the physical evidence you can as rapidly as possible, because you're going to then want to take all that investigative work that's being done to then enable this accountability to take place, whether it's to, again, the international military tribunals in Nuremberg or somewhere else within Germany. So I will just read from a little bit of the text here, and then we can move on to the next few slides, which talk about the liberation of Dachau. So here in the report, again, this is a week after the war is concluded, but it's talking about an event, because I'm trying to do this chronologically. So it's talking about an event that's actually happening between the 19th and the 23rd of April, 1945. So Lieutenant Schoenfeld, so he reports back to the G2 within the 5th Infantry Division that on the morning of the 19th of April, 1945, a train consisting of 54 freight cars pulled into the station of Nammering. It contained about 4,500 men, 100 in each of the wagons. The last 3 cars were filled with about 300 corpses. The first few cars were reserved for the guards and the transport commander. He then goes on to say that the transport was on its way from the concentration camp at Buchenwald to the concentration camp in Dachau, but was forced to detour by bomb damage that was being done to the various railroad stations on its way to Dachau. And so at the next larger station where they could stop, right? This is at a place called Passau. This was damaged. They're then proceeding on to Nammering. This is identified as a place where the train can stop and rest, sort of in air quotes, and they actually use the quotes, a rest, right, before the train can continue to make its way down to Dachau. And I'm about 99% sure, and somebody's going to know the answer out there, that this is the same train, the one going from Buchenwald to Dachau. This is the same train that the 45th Infantry Division is going to encounter sitting there on the siding just outside of Dachau proper, the camp itself, which then serves for many of the reprisals that are going to take place, that are going to be committed by GIs either in or around Dachau. So I'm pretty sure it's the same train. Okay, so then Lieutenant Schoenfeld continues. There were about 150 guards, some in SS uniform, some in the green uniform of the German police. Many of the guards spoke German with a heavy Hungarian accent, which I think is interesting. This kind of goes back to our previous kind of discussion of collaborators. Okay, so heavy Hungarian accent. The boss of the guards and commander of the transport was Meyerbeck, holding the equivalent rank of a first lieutenant. He was formerly a bank employee in Gotha. So again, this gets back to Hannah Arendt's commentary, her scholarship on the banality of evil. So this guy had been a bank employee, right, in Gotha, Germany, right, before the war, and now he's in charge of this death march on wheels, essentially, right, where thousands are going to die before the train ultimately arrives at Dachau. Lieutenant Schoenfeld goes on to say that second in rank and outstanding by his brutality was a short hunchback in a black raincoat. Wow, kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark there. I'm not trying to sort of, inject humor here, but sorry, it kind of comes out, I think about black raincoat, but wow. Yeah, just apparently a real sadist. Okay, and then we get to sort of the heart of what I wanted to focus on. I kind of provide you with some of the context. In this next paragraph, I'll just read a couple of sentences here, and then we can move on. So here, Lieutenant Schoenfeld says that the transport stayed in Nammering from the 9th to the 23rd of April, 1945. Only a few of the sick, undernourished, and brutally beaten men were allowed to leave the cars to fetch water from the houses near the station. And this is an interesting passage here. He says, people living in that neighborhood tried to give, let's see, put my reading glasses on, dramatic pause. All right. People living in that neighborhood tried to give them food, which, however, in most cases was taken away by the guards. Following an appeal by the Catholic priest of Eicher, several hundred pounds of potatoes were prepared and given to those who still had the strength to eat. And so to me, this is just, just really intriguing. So it's fascinating to me because, again, we're talking about this incredibly brutal event. This death march, again, it's not just what's happening on the train. As some of these prisoners are removing corpses and putting them into shallow graves, they in turn are being shot. So it's hundreds and hundreds of individuals, about 800 altogether, that are going to be executed there in the vicinity of Nammering. So there's all that going on, but that Lieutenant Schoenfeld would sort of take the time to include this passage about where at least there are some individuals in the area that are attempting to provide some sort of aid. And I asked the question why. I would suspect that if you can put yourself in the shoes of a GI at the time, you probably aren't sort of favorably disposed to once you've either seen or you have firsthand sort of testimony, or you've observed one of these camps or part of the camp system. You're probably not predisposed to giving a lot of benefit of the doubt to Germans. So the fact that here we are a week after the war is concluded, the Americans have become aware of this atrocity. They're now investigating it. They're going to have Germans dig up the remains, of those that were executed and reinter them. But that Lieutenant Schoenfeld would include this text, I think, is just really intriguing. Why he would do that? Is he trying to be fair? Is he trying to give perhaps some credit where credit is due? Mm-hmm. If you look at it from the German perspective, why are they doing it? Why are they providing food at this sort of late juncture or date in the war? Is it some sort of guilt? Are they being coerced to do it? Do they sort of are they empathetic and they can see that there's some sort of shared basic humanity that is unavoidable? So they feel like they have to provide some sort of sustenance or some sort of provision. Are they just shocked by what they see, and so they're just sort of instinctively unconsciously providing the food? But I think it's just so interesting, again, like given the context of everything that's going on, what we know about what the Third Reich, sort of the system itself, has done to millions of people, and then the complicity of many of your average German. Of course, we can debate what they, the extent to what many of them knew, but that Lieutenant Schoenfeld would include that text, I think, is quite.
It's possibly also because the lieutenant is not yet aware of the massive scale of this. He's seeing a slice of what we now know is a much bigger and more devastating and brutal history. And like anything that is shocking, as human beings, we maybe try and find some kind of rationale to explain the shockingness, because we don't want to accept the fact of what it really means. So I can completely understand. I think Erin said the same thing on her show about Dachau, is that some of the people there, they kind of, their brains tried to convince them it wasn't as bad as they thought it was, and there was some, they were looking for humanity, because perhaps that's what you're trying to find in those situations, rather than admit to yourself that there's this widespread, massive, great extermination going on such at such a large level. So I can understand this is why these accounts are so valuable, because they're fresh, and they are based on that immediate understanding of that small, as I say, that small slice of what we know is a much bigger story. They are themselves witnessing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very, very well put. Well, and if you'd like, Paul, we can continue on to the next.
Yeah. Just to let you know, we're nearly an hour in, and
goodness. Okay, yeah. Noted. All right. Well, let's move on now to Dachau, and I think I've got one more primary source. That's going to be a letter written about the liberation of the Verberlin concentration camp, and then beyond that, it's mainly just looking at some images, and yeah, as you might suspect, I mean, given this topic, that's where we ultimately are going to kind of end up. And so I decided to include some of the more graphic images toward the end. So if at some point again you feel like you want to disengage, there to the audience, I understand perfectly. But that's where we're heading ultimately, is to look at some images, and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, so here turning to Dachau. So we're moving from talking about the death marches, of which there are many thousands of lives lost in the process. Now we're moving into going from a movement, but say between camps, and now looking at the camps themselves. Because we're talking about the U.S. Sector, we're mainly talking about concentration camps or sub-camps within the system. So, and of course, in some cases, you may have a concentration camp that might have over 100 sub-camps associated with it. So that's where we're going next with this. Okay, so in terms of the map orientation, again, lower right-hand corner, you have the location of Dachau. And I would suspect that some, if not many, of the viewers probably have actually been to Dachau. It's relatively close to the city of Munich today. And I did want to say just briefly, about this, kind of give my own study of this particular period and this just traumatic and just monumentally just awful event, that I have had the opportunity to go to Dachau twice. Once was with some friends, and the second time went back a few years ago. This last time was with my family. And so on this particular letter here, it's not that I'm trying to avoid any of the sort of the really difficult parts to get through, but I can remember before we went, and I definitely did not want to sort of coerce my family into going. I wanted it to be, their decision whether they wanted to go there and kind of, experience or get a sense for what had happened there. But we made the family decision that we were going to go to Dachau. And so one of the things that I did before we actually arrived there on site was to read this testimony or this reflection, to my family, to kind of get a sense for what had happened there, what one GI had experienced, what he had seen, felt, smelled, before we arrived on site. And so, yeah, hopefully I'll be able to get through it today. Like I said, we'll hit some of the parts that maybe, I mean, it's all awful and difficult to get through, but I'll do my best. Yeah. I can just recall the first time reading this, and there are parts in here where they're talking about, like the death of a 12-year-old boy. And I can remember my son at the time, about that age, right? And just how can you not be sort of moved emotionally by reading this? And like, there's your son, right? And your own, offspring, and you're thinking about, or reading about someone just like him from some other, nation who just dies this awful, despicable, and unavoidable death, right, in a concentration camp. So on that, so we'll get a little bit into this particular testimony here. So this is coming from a soldier who was with an enlisted man who was with an evacuation hospital. One of the first on-site. So as we talked about, kind of the initial liberators that are coming in, oftentimes they're with combat arms units, combat engineers, field artillery, infantry, cavalry reconnaissance squadron, or whatever. So this is like a follow-on echelon. So we're bringing in more robust medical support capacity to help out those that are at the various camps. So he's with an evacuation hospital. And so let's see, somewhere here. Yep, I've got the actual text itself that we can take a look at. And for many of the viewers, Dachau is considered the first permanent concentration camp. Ultimately, it's going to, there will be 30,000 freed from the camp in late April, actually the 29th of April, 1945. A little more than 30,000 documented deaths. And I think, Paul, as you talked about in one of your previous episodes about the liberation of Dachau, so this all begins on the 29th of April. And sort of to this day, I guess now it would be kind of amongst the kids, the children of the veterans, as to what role the 42nd and the 45th Infantry Divisions played in the liberation of the camp. And for many of you who've been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, any of the liberating divisions has their, so as you walk into the museum, they're off to the left. They've got the flags for all the various liberating divisions. So as you get in there, you'll see the flag for both the 42nd, the Rambo Division, and the Thunderbird Division there, because they're both considered liberating divisions of, for Dachau. Okay, so this is more of a, I try to use primary sources from the time as often as I can. This is one that's a bit more post-war, but I do have some, again, some passages I'd like to share with you, Paul, and the audience. So just a few things here for your reflection and consideration. The first, at the very beginning here of this testimony from this Army Evacuation Hospital soldier, he says, after 43 years, I can still close my eyes and see the high walls that seem to close in and crowd together the thousands of half-alive prisoners in Dachau concentration camp. More than that, I can still smell death piled in the furnaces of the crematories. And so here we see that he's remembering you through multiple senses, right? So it's not just the sight; it's also through smell as well. And of course, he's also beginning to share or to convey some of the psychological trauma he is still feeling multiple decades after being involved in the liberation of this concentration camp. Then later on, and I believe it's on the same slide here, Paul, he talks about where when one high-ranking officer, of course we were talking about a German officer, was shot trying to escape, our hospital unit was pressed into immediate service. It was imperative to try and save his life. As a camp official, he had information which would be used, or which was to be used in the war trials. So again, you've got this dilemma, right? If you're a tactical leader, they're on the ground, or you're the one GI in the area, and you can see, perhaps, the revenge that's being carried out or meted out by prisoners, say on a capo or some auxiliary or member of the camp staff, they're a German. So what do you do there, right? And so if you go there and just allow sort of the mass murder to take place, is sort of as satisfying and as rewarding that might be in the moment, right? If all these camp personnel are murdered on site, basically who's left, basically, right? I mean, for not just the accountability, which I think is particularly critical after an event like this, after the war, or similar events, mass death events or atrocities, but just having their testimony as well, their admission of guilt, documenting what actually happened, say from a Nazi perspective as well. So again, you think about the lengths that these GIs would have to go to, and we can see here this evacuation hospital soldier talking about that, where okay, the German's wounded, but we really need to try to preserve some of these lives, as sort of distasteful as it might feel in the moment, because we actually need to try some of these individuals, particularly the higher ups, right, as we begin to move into the post-war period. And that, Paul, I think it's on the next slide, if we want to go ahead and move forward here. The next passage here. And so the soldier talks about how it was an almost impossible task of setting up hospital wards and receiving the most seriously ill. I was part of a team of laboratory technicians to run tests to determine who was afflicted with typhus fever. Everyone was x-rayed, and the tuberculosis patients were sent to another hospital ward. This work went on day after day. I am not able to express the thoughts that went through my mind as I went into the huts, which had been the homes of these poor people for 3 or 4 years. And so there, again, we think about anticipating requirements. If you're in the midst, say here, the gross human rights violation, anticipating the medical support requirements that are going to be needed, just basically overwhelming the capacity. I mean, even given the millions of GIs that are going to be in the UTO at this time, just completely overwhelming our ability to care for a lot of these individuals. And even with that said, there's also specialist care. So we're looking at Dachau here. But if you look at, say, Bergen-Belsen, and so I think in Paul, you're the Brit, so you're the expert on this. But I believe it's in late April of '45. The powers that be in Britain are actually going to fourth-year medical school students, and they're asking for volunteers They're initially going to be sent into the Netherlands to try to mitigate the effects of the essentially the forced famine that's occurring in the Netherlands in the winter of 44-45. Many of them actually get diverted to go to Bergen-Belsen and are going to be used because initially, again, I mean, these GIs, they're providing, you know, cigarettes or K rations, whatever, and it's just too much. I mean, many of these poor prisoners just they can't, their systems can't handle that sort of food. So we see an instance, at least with Bergen-Belsen, where you have medical school students that are being brought in and trying to determine what sort of is the right, you know, staple, what is the right sustenance that will keep these individuals alive and get them back to a point to where they can begin eating and sort of, you know, processing more solid food. So they go through this entire process of experimentation. I know at one point they're using, let's see here, it's a they call it it's a form of nourishment that's used during the Bengal famine. It's a combination of, I think, rice and sugar, right? And then eventually they go back and they discover that is that's more palatable for a South Asian sort of diet. Right. So they actually go in and add paprika, right, to then again just make it more palatable, more digestible for these individuals who are at Bergen-Belsen. So again, just the overwhelming support required, sort of special support required. And you're just not going to have it all on hand, and how tragic that is to not be able to provide sort of the full support that you want to these individuals who have been, again, in these camps for months, if not years, and have just survived the worst. So that was it on that passage, Paul, and I think I've got just a couple more for Dachau here.
Okay, moved on,
Yeah, and if I may, we don't have to go back to the preceding slide, but you did see there on the slide talking a little bit about reprisals. This ties back into the death march, you know, example we saw where there were survivors of this death march asking for weapons. So we do see, you know, with Dachau, and I think we've all heard the story, right, of the reprisals that take place there. If any of you, and I guess I want to give a little shout out to some of my previous episodes with you, Paul. So if you go back and look at any of the U.S. military crime episodes, there were 3 of them, at least 3 so far, and one talks about the liberation reprisals that take place. So we don't have to get into a bunch of specifics about that right now. Suffice it to say that it's not the only massacre that U.S. troops commit in the ETO or elsewhere, sadly enough. But I will say that fortunately, the scale of the war crimes that we commit are much smaller, right, in magnitude compared to just. I mean, it's almost incomparable to be quite honest, right? We're talking about millions, you know, versus a much smaller number with U.S. troops. But you can go back and look at that, and then also. If it's still out there, when I last checked, it was there. If you want to learn more about or go beyond kind of what you can get on the internet about the Dachau liberation reprisals, there was a great article. I think it was done on the 1st of July. Let's see if I can find it here. 1st of July, 2001. And it was the Boston Globe that did the article. But what's so fascinating about that is the journalist actually interviews all the surviving perpetrators, right? These GIs from the 45th Infantry Division, actually interviews them about what was going through your mind at the time, like why did you commit the reprisals, what were you thinking, what kinds of investigations took place afterwards. So it's really interesting, again, to get kind of that, you know, that firsthand testimony as to why, you know, those reprisals did occur. So last time I checked, it was out there on the internet again, you know, 1 July 2001. And it was published through the Boston Globe, so you can check that out if you'd like. Okay, moving on to, let's see, I think we're on the second page here of the evacuation hospital soldiers' testimony, and so he talks here, continuing on about where a few miles from the camp, from the concentration camp, was the small and beautiful town of Dachau. The people of the town did not believe the stories of the daily mass murders. So a group was brought in to see the piles of dead bodies. They were then made to load a wagon in some of those with some of those bodies and to pull it through their town so that all could see. And of course, we're going to see these types of events take place in many locations. If you go back and look at, again, that documentary I mentioned with the Samuel Fuller's first film that comes out, where they're loading some of the corpses there at the Falkenau on wagons, and they're taking them through the town. Of course, we're also familiar with many units inviting, and it's probably putting it lightly, inviting, coercing, directing German civilians from the nearest town to come out and see what their government, many of their countrymen and women had perpetrated in their name, not just witnessing or seeing, but also in some cases having to bury the remains, the remains of these various unfortunate souls as well. And he goes on to say, beyond again the wagons being pulled through the town of Dachau. So this evacuation hospital soldier also mentions that we had all heard of the gas chambers and crematories, but it had seemed to be just propaganda. The sight of train loads and great piles of naked dead bodies showed us the truth. And so despite the fact, and again, you can go back and look at the work that Ken Burns did a few years back about, what did the average U.S. citizen, what did the U.S. government know about the Holocaust, tracing it all the way back to the 30s with the Nuremberg laws and Kristallnacht and all this, what we knew at the time. Even then, and we see this repeated again and again in this firsthand first-person testimony, where for many of these GIs, it's not until they see it firsthand, like they're on the ground, that they realize that, hey, this wasn't just propaganda or rumors or stories that might be half-truths. It's the real thing, but I had to see it with my own eyes, really, to understand kind of the extent of, again, this banality and this magnitude of evil. I think it's on maybe the next slide there, Paul. Again, it's part of the testimony. I think it's on this one here, and you can see here after liberation on the 29th of April, a couple of GIs from the 45th that are standing guard at the main entrance to the Dachau camp, which of course is no longer standing. If you go to Dachau, as many of you have, you go through the Jourhaus, with the famous, I guess it's wrought iron, right? Probably with the Arbeit macht frei, right? That's the way that you go onto the campgrounds. But again, just continuing on here. So our medical soldier, our lab technician, who probably never thought in a million years when he was going through training as a lab technician right back in the States that he would ever have to use the skills that he learned in this sort of just unbelievable situation, right? So there's a lot of text in here where the soldier's talking about interacting with and talking with various surviving prisoners there at Dachau, but I will bring it to your attention, maybe one or two. So the soldier talks about how with one prisoner who had told me that he'd been a professional photographer, showed me a coffee can containing about 5 rolls of undeveloped film. He had smuggled a very small camera and film into the prison and kept it hidden. He said his pictures told the stories of the brutal treatment in the camp. He was going to sell them to a magazine. This man, more dead than alive, didn't weigh more than 50 pounds. I thought he would never live. Every day when I checked on him, he would smile and take the coffee can from under his pillow and look inside. 2 months later, he shook hands with me and left for his homeland. I believe to this day that the one thing that enabled him to defeat death was his coffee can filled with undeveloped film. Right. Wow. So you were talking about documenting and the lengths that these prisoners would go to try to document, whether it was the number of specific names of prisoners who had died, or here we have actual, pictorial evidence. I know as I was getting ready for this, there at Buchenwald, there actually is a radio transmitter is how you'd put it, right? So they've hidden a radio transmitter in the prisoners' sort of movie viewing room, which I never would have associated prisoner movie viewing with Buchenwald, but perhaps it was primarily for propaganda purposes. But they have actually managed to hide this transmitter. And so 3 days before the arrival of U.S. troops, they're using this hidden transmitter. And you can just imagine what would have happened to these prisoners, right? If the transmitter was discovered, this can of film was discovered, what would have happened to them, right? But they actually managed to send out transmissions in multiple languages out, and it actually is received by Third Army. They get the transmission on the 8th of April. Hey, please, essentially, come to our assistance. Third Army actually does respond almost immediately after the last transmission goes out. And then, of course, we see 3 days later, we actually have troops on the ground there at Buchenwald. But just the risks that one would take, right, to try to document what was occurring in the camps, just beyond words. Another thing that our medical soldier talks about beyond the amateur photographer, he also says that many of the people had been prisoners so long that to be set free was not a reality. The fight for survival carried long after. Every day, someone would hide a slice of bread or some other food under his pillow, still fearing that there would be no food the next day. There had never been enough food to go around. The food had been brought to them in large cans, and if a person was unable to walk or crawl outside where it was placed, he went without. Half were slowly dying from malnutrition, and all weighed less than 100 pounds. Right? So just, you think about that. And again, the resources that are going to be required to try to nurse as many of these individuals back to health, as they can. And you also think about, and I think one of your previous guests talked about this, that the liberation is really just, it's only the beginning. I mean, you've survived day, right? Day by day, you've survived the next roll call where you're standing, outdoors in inclement weather for hours, right? And in some cases, dropping dead, right, on the appel plots. You've made it through all that, and yes, liberation is great, and you're happy, and now you're getting some more food, some more sustenance. You're getting some medical support. The people that are trying to do everything they can to nurse you back to health, but that's really only the first step, right? And I guess the pun kind of there is intended, right? It's not just, okay, well, I've been liberated, but of course, in the case of Dachau and many other camps, and I think I may have already mentioned it, or maybe it's later on in this testimony, where there are huge concerns that the typhus, the tuberculosis is going to spread outside the camps. And so you can imagine if you've survived 3, 4, 5, or maybe even more years in captivity, everything that you've been through, and now your liberators have come and they don't want to let you leave the camp because they're concerned that, again, we could see something literally grow to perhaps epidemic scale, right? If all these individuals, with dysentery, typhus, et cetera, are just let on their own sort of devices or designs to leave the camp without proper medical treatment. So, and even then for them, okay, so I've been liberated, but you're telling me I can't leave the camp for the next month or two until the treatment's over. You kind of make your way through all that, and then beyond all that, it's okay. Well, now what do I do? Am I going to try to return home to Poland or Hungary or Italy or wherever I'm from? How many of my family, still remain? So it's a multi-month or multi-year sort of just, journey of survival from one day to the next, even after these poor souls have been liberated from the camps.
Absolutely.
And I think there are one or two more passages here, Paul, for Dachau, and then we can move on to
the next slide now. Next slide.
I guess there. Yep.
Yep.
And we'll finish up with the testimony here of our evacuation hospital soldier. Okay, so at the very end of his post-war testimony, and of course you can see there some of the various inmates, children and men. Of course, there are women in many of these camps as well. Probably the best known camp for women, almost exclusively for women, is Ravensbrück, which we won't really spend too much time talking about today, but probably worth bringing in. This is probably as good a point as any when we talk about the women inmates. And so, there's an entirely different dimension that you bring into the camp experience, and then what these GIs are witnessing and what they're hearing about. So now it's not just, it's the forced labor, the medical experiments. Now we're talking about things like, sexual violence. We're in some cases, we're actually talking about consensual sex. Surprisingly, even between prisoners, if you can believe that. So that's happening. You've got instances where children are being born in the camps, or women prisoners are trying to find a way to abort, right, a pregnancy in the camps. So again, just an entirely different dimension comes into play here, and that's from the prisoner perspective. Then you think about, for example, with Bergen-Belsen or with Buchenwald, and so in some cases you also have women SS auxiliaries that are also part of the camp system as well. So there's the trying to think of her name, notorious Irma Gresa at she's at Buchenwald, and I won't use the name that they actually use colloquially for her, right?
Yeah.
I think you know who I'm talking about. Yeah,
we do.
Buchenwald. Yeah, and then of course you have Ilse Koch, who is the wife of the commandant at Buchenwald, and of course there are all sorts of stories about what she's doing with lampshades and et cetera, right? So So women are also complicit, not just as, well, not complicit as prisoners, but women are involved as prisoners, but also complicit, right, in terms of supporting, enabling the camp system. And again, many of just the absolute horrors and atrocities that are taking place within. Okay, so finally, we have the last couple of passages, pardon me, for our medical soldier. And so he wraps up by saying, when we walked by the enclosure, all the prisoners who could walk or crawl came to the barbed wire to talk to us. The camp remained closed to avoid the risk of an epidemic. It would be quite a few days before they would understand why we couldn't liberate them at once. What they couldn't understand was that to set them free would have started an epidemic, which would have spread over all of Europe. People went on dying in Dachau. It's estimated that more than 300 prisoners a day must have died during the actual occupation of the camp by the Americans. And at the end, and this is how the soldier wraps up his testimony, he says, "It gave us all a good feeling for having had a small part in helping these pitiful people regain their health and self-respect that had been denied them. I know all of us who spent a short time so close to the smell of death will never forget Dachau." Right? So again, just how these various liberators are remembering the experience through multiple sentences, and how they're just scarred for life. And of course, we all handle trauma in different ways, but it's unavoidable, right? That you're going to never forget these experiences, and kind of your remembrances, your memory will sort of play out and manifest in different ways. And I know that my mother's father, both my grandfathers were in war too, probably as many of your grandfathers and fathers probably were, but pretty stoic guy. And there were a few times where he sat down with me and talked at length about his war experiences. But the one thing that I can recall him talking about when it came to the camps, either going into or passing near a subcamp in Plattling, Germany, which is near the border of Austria and Czechoslovakia, that was the one thing he said, that he would never forget the smell of that place, right? So and
as you said there, Mark, that the liberators themselves, be they British, American, or Soviet, as you said, they probably didn't want to talk about it and the sounds and smells and sights. But in the years that followed, there would be that sense of not wanting to say that it upset you, because you'd be somehow subconsciously comparing your experience to that of the people you discovered, whose experience was, of course, infinitely worse. So yeah. you might feel really, if you were living in New York, for example, and you were a soldier in the 42nd Division, you had a bad few days liberating that camp, which understandably was a bad few days, and it preyed on your mind because of the Holocaust. I can completely understand why they just kept a lot of it to themselves, because there would be the feeling like you're comparing your experience with that of those who were in those camps. So yeah, it's complicated.
Absolutely. Yeah, just the way that we process very, very traumatic events, remember them, recall them, choose to recall them or not. I mean, it's just it's endlessly fascinating from a psychological standpoint. Yeah, so absolutely agree with what you're saying there. Well, let's move on to the last letter here. Yep. So this is Verbalin. So yeah, we got to bring in the airborne, right? We've talked about let's see, I guess we talked about infantry divisions being involved, armored divisions being involved in the Holocaust liberation. So we'll bring in a little bit of the airborne, and of course we talked about Easy Company, right? 506 with Kalerfing Lager 4. But let's turn now to the 82nd, right? The All-American division. So this is a letter that's being written home on VE Day. So as you can see at the very top, it says Victory Day, May 8th, 1945. This is being written by an officer. In our previous examples, of course, they were enlisted. This is written by an officer to his wife and to his baby son. I don't know if he might have been a warrant officer, because he talks about here on the first page, you might see it about halfway down, he talks about prosecuting court-martials. And so on division judge advocate staffs, you would typically have some officers as well as warrant officers. Anyway, right, so higher ranking than an NCO in this particular case, but he's writing this letter, writing the letter home, and this is literally the day after Verbalin, or actually it's a few days after Verbalin has been liberated, but it's the day after a large public sort of remembrance ceremony that takes place in the town of Ludwigslust, right on the 7th of May. So this is the very next day that he's writing this letter home to his family. Okay, so he begins by saying here that this has been the day we have waited for over 3 years, and never did I believe that I would accept it with so small a degree of enthusiasm and fanfare. And of course, Paul, you've read many and talked to veterans firsthand, just sort of how the end of the war is almost anticlimactic, right? I mean, given what they've been through, right? It's like it's just another day. Then he talks about how I was prosecuting a court-martial when the first news was broadcast of the unconditional surrender acceptance by the Germans. This afternoon, I have another trial, so you can see that V-Day or no, my work goes on just the same. So it's just another day, right? Yes, it's great that it's VE Day. The war is over in Europe, although, of course, again, the trauma is going to continue for our, the camp prisoners we've been talking about. But this this officer's work is continuing all the same. He then goes on to talk about later on in the letter here, a little bit further down the page. He says, you have read volumes of the atrocities accomplished by the cruel party leaders over here, and undoubtedly your reaction has been much the same as mine. One of doubt, exaggeration, and possibly skeptical of propaganda. Let me assure you that anything that has been said could never give the true picture of the torture suffered by these poor inmates. And we talked about this earlier, right? It's when you're seeing it there on the ground, in person, it just takes on. I mean, it perhaps might have been lost through radio broadcasts or reading about it in the paper, and sort of maybe taking that as a half truth or a partial truth, but now it's just fascinating the lengths that this officer wants to go to communicate and to convince, right? To convince his wife that, okay, you've heard about this kind of thing happening. It's been in the newspaper, it's been on the radio, but let me assure you, this is the real thing. And you can't even begin to comprehend the magnitude of the depravity and the horror that's taken place over here. So he's really trying to stress that and get it across to his wife. Okay, later on in the letter, and and everybody can basically read the chart there about so Verberlin, it's a subcamp of the Neuengamme camp system. About 1,000 are going to be found dead at liberation. About 5,000 inmates at its height, and I think, as I already said before, it's going to be the 82nd and also the 8th Infantry Division that will liberate the camp on the 2nd of May, and then you get this public remembrance burial ceremony that's going to take place on the 7th of May, which is the day before this letter is being written. So we'll go ahead and continue on, and I'll talk a little bit, or actually, forgive me, our officer will talk about, as we put ourselves in his shoes, a little bit about the ceremony that takes place on the 7th of May. So if we go on to the next slide here. Yep, and of course, also, if you look at the map there, you can see where Verberlin is in northern Germany. And we see here a chaplain from the 82nd who's helping one of the former camp prisoners. And one thing I thought was interesting, looking at this particular instance where, because again, the war's not over, right? This is the 2nd of May, 45. Nobody really knows how much longer the war is going to last. It's actually the commander, I think, of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Colonel Ekman, who initially doesn't even want the soldiers, the troops, the paratroopers to go into the camp. Initially, he allows the chaplain and I think 1 or 2 other GIs to go in. But as we talked about before, he's concerned about, again, force protection. What is this going to do to my soldiers? I don't know if there's TB in there, typhus, God knows what. And I still have to maintain, if you're the regimental commander of the 505th, I have to maintain combat power. I still have to be able, once I leave this camp, right, and someone else follows on, with sustainment, medical support, all this, I still have to be able to take my regiment, right, and then continue to fight across the remainder of the Third Reich to defeat the Wehrmacht, right? So initially, he doesn't want his paratroopers, his troopers going in, right? So, which is interesting. The decisions again being made, he knows how bad it is. The individual's dying by the hundreds inside, but hey, I still have to preserve combat power. Eventually, he sort of, after a few days, makes the decision that, hey, I will allow more troops to go in to assist the remaining prisoners that are still alive within Verberlin. Okay, so a little bit further on down here, our officer talks about, again, talking to some of the prisoners that are still alive. He says, he's talking to a French doctor in this particular case. He says, or writes to his wife, I asked why so many bodies had not been buried, and his answer gave exactly the testimony one would never expect to find. The dead were buried regularly, but during the past 4 months, the death rate rose so rapidly that those still alive were too weak to dig even a shallow grave and carry the body to it. So what we see, in these final weeks, months of the war, it's the camp system is beginning to break down, right? And there's one little book excerpt, if we have time, I'll share a little bit later on, but the guards are beginning to flee. What little food there is, electricity, water, whatever it might happen to be, what little is available to these prisoners, it's just the system is breaking down completely. There's nobody left to move bodies to the crematoria or elsewhere, right? So that's why we tend to see in these images, and it's the stereotypical, we have thoughts about what the camps look like. That's why we see these masses of bodies. And in most cases, the camp system was just breaking down. Of course, it doesn't make it any, it's still horrible, right? I mean, whichever way you look at it, right? I mean, still, these people would have been incinerated in a crematoria or sort of left out there on the ground to die. In either event, they've been murdered, right, unnecessarily, and quite heinously. But the system's breaking down. So the officer goes on beyond references here to the not being able to dig shallow graves, for those who had died in the camp. Initially before the GIs had arrived. He then talks about how I wish all the people of the world could view this bizarre picture, not for its sadistic value, but rather to impress upon all nations for all time that no treatment is severe enough for the German nation in retaliation for the crimes they have perpetrated during the course of this war. And once again, we see a foreshadowing of what needs to occur, what should occur in the post-war period, which is extensive accountability, right? A judicial process to hold individuals accountable for what had occurred. Okay, and the next slide, please, Paul. Okay, and I believe this is where they talk about the ceremony that happens. Of course, again, we mentioned before the civilians that are being brought in order to come in and look at what had happened in the camps and their names. So you can see some civilians from Ludwigslust coming in, right, to see some of the again, just the horror that remained there at Verbelen. And so here the officer begins talking about the ceremony itself that's going to take place, and it's going to involve both the German Bürgermeister, or the mayor of Ludwigslust, which was the town closest to Verbelen. And it's also going to include military personnel from the 82nd as well. Okay, so this is a little passage where the officer's relating to his wife what the German Bürgermeister was saying to the German civilians who had gathered for this memorial ceremony. Okay, so he says the civilians were told by the German Bürgermeister, or mayor, that this atrocity grave facing their city hall would forever be a reminder to them of the cruelty of their leaders during the war. That although they had no direct hand in these crimes, interesting commentary there, yet the camp being only a few miles from their town, they never took the time or trouble to investigate. That as long as the government in power was their representatives, the people must accept the responsibility for all the acts of the government, that he had served the community as mayor, this is the German mayor, for 35 years, and that what the American officials were about to tell them was the truth, because he had read every word of the speeches, had visited the camp, and saw the truth, that those who doubted his word should take the time to walk out to the prison and see for themselves. And then also following on, when the Americans begin their portion of this memorial ceremony, they talk about where or how the local German government and the civilians are going to have to erect a suitable monument there in town for this atrocity, again, that had occurred in their name. And so initially, and I think maybe it's on the next slide, where you have German civilians from Ludwigslust that are burying a lot of the dead from Verbelen. They're actually burying the dead adjacent to the city hall. I mean, it's like if you're a German civilian and going, like, it's going to be a constant reminder, right? The crosses and the stars of David, it's unavoidable, right? What had happened in your name, or you may have been involved in, or complicit, right? So, and yeah, you can see some of the buildings there in the background, right? And you can see the German civilians burying many of the victims who had died at Verbelen. And then, and I believe this is the end. Yeah, this is the end of this officer's letter, where he talks about how it's important to impress on all future generations with the futility of war and the destruction it has brought to the German people during this period. That the same procedure, again, this memorial ceremony and the burial of the prisoners who had died, that the procedure is to be duplicated in many other villages throughout Germany, although on a smaller scale. And then he closes by saying, I feel the effect, while possibly temporary, is deep. And so before we go on, there's not too much left here, but one thing that I have found fascinating in trying to find these primary sources, and we could have a discussion about this, why this is the case. But one thing I would say is it is very difficult to find letters written by GIs either during or after the war where they go into this much depth about a particular concentration camp. And
yeah, makes sense.
And we could ask the questions why. I mean, of course, once the war is over with, censorship has been lifted, right? And so you can express a lot more than you could have during the war itself about troop movements or dates or units, whatever, what have you. But yeah, it's difficult to find these first-person narratives that are appearing in letters, maybe more commonly in diaries that are being sent back home. But like the question is why? Why is it that you, at least in my experience, you typically find that these events are isolated to maybe one letter, and maybe it's a few lines of text. It's pretty rare to find almost an entire letter that's all about, one specific camp and one person's experience there. So we could talk about that, but rarely do you find multiple letters where a soldier is talking about over the course of whatever 4 or 5, half a dozen letters talking about repeatedly this camp experience.
I think it's like the fact that even the war diaries and the morning reports and the after action reports seem to get less wordy in 1945. I think it's trauma fatigue. It's just everybody's just fed up. All these units have seen some of their friends killed. They've been at it for however many months or years, and there is a sense that the end is in sight, and there's a turning of the page, and there'll be peace. They'll be going back home. They'll be marrying your childhood sweetheart. And I think everyone's just had enough. I mean, because we're adding this liberation of camps story on the back of some of these units have been fighting through Northwest Europe for years. So it's not, I mean, okay, some of the units are fairly fresh to the battlefield, but not the 82nd, not the 45th. So no. I think I can understand it. As I say, you see that with war diaries being, you see it with came up with discussion with Norma Graham about, I forget the name of the Canadian officer in Italy, Farley Mowat, or what his name, is that the 1945 accounts just get shorter and less colorful and just more kind of the recording of dates. So I think a lot of it is that, and also how the hell does a normal human being even put this kind of stuff into words? How
exactly?
How would you can write about the fact as a GI, you haven't had a postal delivery for a while, and you wish you had a new pair of socks or something, but and you missed the homestead. But explaining your discovery of the camps, how do you even put pen to paper?
Yeah, exactly. And part of what I was thinking about or speculating is how much of this is trying to, as I think I mentioned earlier, how much of this is as succinctly as possible trying to communicate, trying to convince whatever, some family member or a friend or something that these things really did happen. But doing it in a way that sort of shields the recipient. I mean, so that you aren't just traumatizing somebody else with just like graphic, And then two, if you've gone through this traumatic experience, I mean, do you really want to sort of re-traumatize yourself by having to go through and sort of line by line, right? I mean, and the kind of detail here we see in like a 3 or 4 page letter, and go through a lot of detail about what had happened and what you saw, and just it came
up in the show with Miles Bingham last week or the week before about his mother's Blitz diary. So she started war at 9 or 10 years old, and by 45 I think she was 15 or possibly 16, and how she went to the cinema and saw a Pathé film of, I think it was the Liberation of Belsen, and how unprepared she was for how visceral it was going to be and how much it traumatized her as a 16 or 15 or 16-year-old girl. And this is a girl who'd seen the Blitz. She'd seen bodies pulled out of houses and had not in any way been protected from the horrors of the war. But even so, a black and white film projected on a screen in a cinema was enough for her to put it in her diaries without describing it specifically as how traumatic it was. You talked about the senses and things, but yeah, no, it's understandable why people who had experienced this would try and maybe think about limiting the exposure their relatives and people they cared about had to it. I've gone through this, so you don't have to, kind of mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But, yeah.
Very well put. Well, so we are getting closer to the end here. I'm sure you're thankful for that, and perhaps your audience as well. But for those of you who are still out there, thank you very much for sticking with it. But we are closing in on the conclusion. So I'd mentioned that, and I'll just grab the book here. I'd mentioned that I was going to refer to a book excerpt here that talks about, why we tend to see these images, the stereotypical images, at the end of the war of the massive numbers of bodies, whether they're lying on the ground or they're piled on top of what and I think one of your previous guests talked about this, a griddle, like this colloquial. I mean, it's just horrible, right? But they would cross railroad tracks and then basically create a funeral pyre. So again, just wanted to give you some first person reference here, some text on this. So this is from a book. It's called Men in Power, written by Henry J. Taylor. He publishes it right after the war. So he is a journalist, economist, radio broadcaster, kind of a Renaissance man. But during the war, I mean, he spends much of the war kind of going back and forth. He's actually in Nazi Germany before the war. But anyway, by 45, he's with the troops, kind of at the head of the advance as they're penetrating further and further into the Third Reich. And so I was just going to share with you what he says about why the camps kind of looked the way that they did as they were moving further and further and coming in closer proximity with the camps. So publishes a book right after the war. So he says, as our columns advanced and the Nazi guards received the news over the radio, they stole away. In every case, there was a general exodus of the guards from the horror camps, beginning 2 or 3 weeks before we arrived. At Belsen, only 29 elite guard henchmen and 10 Nazi women guards remained. Belsen's SS commandant, Kramer, he of the famous photograph showing the manacles we put on his ankles, sitting shoeless in a chair, was one of the few head men caught among all the camps in Germany. As the guards went away and the camp facilities were unattended, the pump stopped, the water stopped, the lighting stopped, the food stopped. The crematoria truck stopped coming for the bodies of those who died, and the crematorium itself ceased to function. Discipline broke down completely. The men and women tore the inside fences down, and 40,000 mixed together in the most awful days and nights of anguish, murder, theft, and abysmal degradation the mind can imagine. Typhus soon set in. Death swept the camps. Most of the deaths were caused by this typhus scourge at the end, feeding on starvation and the unbelievable filth. Right. So again, that's why we tend to see the images that we do, and we're getting closer to that point here in the presentation where we are going to see some images. I have one that's it's an artistic rendering from the time. It's still pretty graphic, but then beyond that, it's all going to be images. And then I've got some statistics at the very end. Again, it just kind of gets to the magnitude of what happened between 33 and 45.
Based on previous experience, Mark, and how YouTube works with the algorithm, I'm not going to hold the images on screen for very long. We'll if you want to carry on talking at the end, but in order for this not to be demonetized, I'll just hold them on screen for a bit and move through. So it's the best way, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, makes perfect sense. Yep. So we will do that. Okay, so let's go. Yep. So we're going to go first. So this is a combat artist's depiction of what he saw at Gunskirchen, which was in Austria, liberated right there at the very end of the war, the 4th of May 45, by the 71st Infantry Division. And so this was one of multiple renderings that this combat artist did that was actually available. I mean, it was like many of your guests know. Like, so when the war was over, either in Germany, if they could get it published there, or in some cases back in the States, like Infantry Journal was a big publisher of these. But like you'd be able to either buy or you'd be given the unit history, right, for your division, regiment, battalion, whatever the case was. And so this image, along with a variety of combat art that was done by this particular artist, was available to the soldiers once the war was over. So this is just, you know, one of many. And Paul, you talked about some of these late war divisions, like the 89th, right? Discovering Ordre, the 71st, a late war division. Nonetheless, right, I mean, they're seeing the worst of humanity, irrespective of what they saw in combat or didn't, but they're seeing the worst of humanity now in these camps. Now, if you, I don't know, Paul, if you wouldn't mind, I do have, there is a little bit of a letter that I thought might be helpful before we get into the images. Kind of up to you if you.
Okay, yeah, please. I'll put it back on the text of the book so we don't have it on screen. So read the letter, then I'll move through the images. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll try to keep this pretty succinct. I actually do have the letter in my collection. For some reason, this morning I discovered it wasn't in the slides. So I'll just read a little bit to you. And this, I think, ties into and gives us a segue into the images. Okay. So this is a soldier who wasn't there for the liberation of Ordre on the 4th of April. But as with these German civilians who are either being invited or ordered to go to the camps, we also see that up and down the chain of command, Eisenhower, like all the way down, right? They are encouraging any GIs that can do so to go and visit, kind of in air quotes, what a visit, right? But to go and see firsthand these camps. And so I didn't include in the presentation, but like they're actually handing out little passes. If you want to go to Dachau, you have to have this visitor's pass before you can go to the camp. And they're going to Buchenwald. But anyway, this letter is written by a soldier who had visited Ordre after its liberation. And this, again, ties back into the images we're going to see later on. So he says, I went with a couple. Let me go back and get my glasses here, which are somewhere. Sorry. Okay, so I went with a couple of other guys, and we followed this stream of customers, which is kind of an interesting word, customers, through a gate in the barbed wire fence. Bodies of 10 or 12 Russians were there, still in their prison uniforms. And this is the excerpt that ties into the images. The GI stood around and looked without saying much. Quite a few had cameras, and about the only noise was the clicking as they took pictures. Whatever conversation there was carried out in murmurs. So here you just ask yourself, you know, what would be a GI's motivation? Of course, these GIs are experiencing an entire range of emotions. They're kind of internalizing, processing what they're seeing differently. But there are a number of GIs, again, who are visiting the camps that are taking pictures. So again, you know, what might be the motivation to do so? It's one thing, you know, to take pictures of enemy dead. Those aren't all that uncommon. I mean, to find soldiers who took those kinds of pictures. But then we see them taking images of this brutality, right? This genocide as well. The soldier goes on to say, the visitor to Ordre also says, again, in talking to some of the prisoners who were still on site, he says that all the information about the life of the camp was being given by 3 surviving Russians to a Russian-speaking guy in our outfit. I don't see any reason for doubting it. In a case like that, exaggeration is superfluous. The civilians in the nearby town pretended not to know what had been going on in the camp, but they did know. Daily, they saw the starved people working on the roads and projects. They saw the crematory, all right. It was in plain sight of the road, and there were cultivated fields nearby. The farmers knew. Anybody who passed on that road knew. When they burned those bodies, 40 or 50 at a time, I guess you could smell it for miles. And again, references to smell there. A couple more things he says that I'll bring the audience's attention. First is that all the killing, this is all the killing at Ordre, all the killing there was not out of sadism or cruelty, though there may have been sadists among the Germans in the camp, of course. It was simply the methodical killing off of an inferior race. And then finally at the end, he talks about having a better appreciation for living in a free democratic society. Now having seen what kind of, you know, what fascism, authoritarianism, dictatorship, and racial prejudice, sort of the slippery slope you put yourself on, and how that ultimately can degenerate, right, to mass murder, to genocide. So he closes by saying, but what I also know now is that the democratic countries have their sets of ideas, and they too are real and effective. I did not used to think that way. I would hear a dumb politician spout nothings about the four freedoms when all he knew was the inside of his own wallet, and I would say something sarcastic. But even though the politician doesn't really know what he's talking about, the words are still true. I used to think that talk about the four freedoms, and here he's talking about FDR's address on the 6th of January, 1941. I used to think that the talk about the four freedoms and democracy and such was all hogwash, and I even had an argument with a friend about it once. I guess I did not use my imagination. I had to be shown, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, there he's talking about the four freedoms being freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. FDR promoting global democratic values, and what happens again in a society that has adopted fascism or some form thereof, and then the consequences of that. Okay, so again, the remaining slides, aside from the statistics, Paul, are just the various images, and like you said, we don't want to get this demonetized or to not have it accessible to people. So what I'll just say is that these are not just random images that I plucked off of the internet. These are all images that are part of my collection. And when I was buying, various groups that belong to different GIs, these were actually in the groups, right? So along with uniforms and medals and discharges and whatever, these pictures, these images you're going to see were in these groupings as well. And they're in here for a soldier from the 4th Armored Division, one from the 6th Armored Division, and then a woman who was an Army nurse with the 42nd General Hospital. So you see both a woman's and men's perspectives on what they'd viewed there, at the camps. You won't be surprised by the images. It's the kind of thing, that sadly, many of us have. Well, I think we need to see these kinds of images, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that you have seen before. And as we go through, I would just ask you to reflect. I mean, as you tried to put yourself in the shoes of these liberating GIs, just ask yourselves, why would you maybe take the pictures in the first place, or if they were pictures being sort of mass produced and available to lots of GIs, why would you bring them home? Is it a kind of some sort of token of remembrance? Is it to be able to convince someone someday, some Holocaust denier or some skeptic, that, oh, that didn't really happen, and I don't believe what you're saying. Like, you've got the actual evidence, So, but just you ask yourself the question, and again, there would be a whole variety of reasons, I think, why these GIs would bring these images home, and maybe they wouldn't see the light of day for 40, 50 years. They'd go into a box perhaps or something, but but to keep these images for all those years, of what you'd seen. And again, I mean, it's just one more sort of, venue for perhaps, re-traumatizing yourself, having to see these images again. But I mean, just, again, maybe being reminded of just how inhumane, how brutal humans can be, to one another. So again, Paul, you can feel free, pardon me, to kind of cycle through kind of the.
I'm just going to move through these quickly. I mean, people can freeze frame it later if they need to. I mean, it's not that I want to move on through them. It's the fact it's the demonetization process. So we'll just go through them there. And as I say, it's from my point of view in terms of hosting this channel, is that no matter how many times I see images that are essentially the same, they all show piles of bodies and the same devastation, they never have less of an impact on me and my head. It's not, if I ever get to the point where I feel acclimatized to them, I'll stop doing this. I would say, okay, now time to if I've been desensitized by it so much, I just go, yeah, no, that's fine again. I mean, they should still be shocking. They should still shake us to our core. And we had to ban a bloody apologist in the sidebar earlier on, Mark. The fact that these idiots are out there, dismissing this historical event as propaganda, and it boils my piss, for want of a better expression. But yeah.
It's mind-boggling. I mean, I'm just showing a mere fraction of what I've been able to gather, but just the evidence is overwhelming. I just don't know how you could possibly conclude that this is all fabricated or whatever. Just beyond my understanding. But so as you went through, I know obviously for for a whole variety of reasons, you had images in there from Ohrdruf, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. There were quite a few of those, and then I thought it was intriguing to bring in images of that Army nurse had taken
Yeah.
as well. It's just, and really, I mean, there's not much difference in terms of what she's photographing and what the male GIs are photographing, right? But you do see there, for instance, I think on one you showed the women prisoners, behind the wire there at Dachau. There's of course, there's the infamous train, right? Sadly, and then you can see what some of the prisoners were doing to some of the various SS guards there.
And I wonder, Mark, whether some of these people, especially those that were officers and perhaps had more of an education and an understanding of a wider context, like we postulated that Eisenhower is somehow anticipating Holocaust denial. I mean, his insistence of having people coming in and taking photos and films as if he's somehow seeing what the world is going to go to, and people will say, no, this thing never happened. Because I can completely understand there'd been those issues earlier on with the graphic photos from Tarawa and Peleliu and upsetting American people, and there'd been issues with the British press as well about exactly what sort of images you should be put in newspapers. But it seems that some of these people are, even if they're not consciously thinking it, they're thinking, I need to record this because people won't believe this. There will be a time when people believe it. And as you just said, Mark, it is the most documented crime probably in human history. I mean, the Nazis did it themselves. They kept their own records of the transports and everything else. And so the people who deny it haven't got a leg to stand on. But it is interesting whether some of these people, like the nurse, somehow were thinking, because you're not going to be thinking, it's not, if you pick up a camera in that environment, it's not like taking a photo of you and your best friend in front of the Notre Dame in Paris, or it's it's a conscious effort to take something, an image of something that is horrific. And this is an era when we now, with our cell phones, we can take as many photos as we want of the nice hot dog we've just eaten. We don't even consider it. This is film and camera where every image is costing you money. It's precious. You've got to get developed. I'm really pleased these people did take photos, because I'm not sure that's how my brain would work in that situation.
Yeah. I think it would just be overwhelming to just process and just try to function at all under the circumstances. It's just hard to believe that anyone would have kind of the wherewithal. But again, I guess if you've got soldiers who've been seasoned, by combat and desensitized to a fair extent. Although even then, I mean, this just goes beyond the sort of the scale of what many of them had ever seen. Just that you'd have, again, the wherewithal to take some of these images. But thankfully they did. Thankfully they did. The last...
we'll let you wrap things up with these last slides.
I'll just gloss over the next four. We don't need to get into a bunch of specificity here. It's just this is where I was going to look a little bit at again some of the extrajudicial steps that were taken by GI, sort of like in the heat of the moment. We already talked about the Dachau reprisals, but kind of how they were reacting, the decisions they were making, maybe vengeance that they were sort of meting out, or they were enabling prisoners to do so in those, say, hours of the short days after liberation. One more thing I wanted to say, and I don't know if this is like inappropriate or morbid, but I do have to just ask one thing, and we don't need to go back to the images again. People can go back and take a look if they'd like, but I do find it interesting that, say with the Dachau images, so the camp's liberated on the 29th of April, that Army nurse doesn't arrive at the camp until the 3rd of May, right? You look at Ohrdruf, liberated on the 4th of April. I think what Eisenhower and other various senior leaders arrived there. I'm spitballing, but I want to say it's maybe a week or two later. I just the corpse is on the ground for that long. It would be interesting to find out. I mean, and somebody probably has done some scholarship on this. Like, at what point, right? It's like, do you need to bury their remains, right? I mean, with the nurse, okay, those have been like on the train now for days and days, and I got it. Like you had to conduct like a forensic investigation, try to figure out who they were, what happened to them, kind of piece the whole story together. I mean, again, for prosecution later on. But and again, maybe it's inappropriate speculation, but I just wonder, like, I mean, why are you keeping the bodies on the ground for, I mean, maybe weeks at a time, right? Like, when is enough, right? When do you Inter these, like, give these people some dignity, right, and inter them in some
No,
kind of grave.
I see what you mean, Mark. I mean, on a pure empathetic human level, I can understand why there wasn't a much speedier process to give these people a burial. But maybe as we sort of just speculate, there's a sense of the gravitas of the situation, a sense of the need to make sure everything is absolutely recorded and itemized, and of the right people looking at it, medical experts, criminal experts, you know, so that and to make sure, someone's bound to have done some scholarship on that, and maybe there were reports on where people were speculating, you know, suggesting what's our time frame here? Do we, you know, when do we start clearing this up? I mean, I'm thinking about how sometimes they conduct, you know, investigations to crime scenes these days of mass murderers. Well, they'll have these tents set up for weeks. I'm thinking of the Fred West and Rosemary West murder house in England a few years ago. I mean, that investigation went on at a forensic level for weeks, as I recall. I mean, if not months. So, I mean, it's decades apart. But I guess that's why it was. But Trevor is saying, was it recognized as a crime scene? I mean, I suppose it was. I mean, Anyway, back to you.
Yeah, and you just think about that medical soldier. I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole, but you think about that medical soldier, right? He's not some infantryman who's there for 24 hours or 36 hours and then he's on his way to continue fighting the war. It's obviously it's bad enough and hard enough for them. But what if you're that medical soldier who, I mean, as he says, I mean, he's there for, I think he says, months, right? Like at one point, I mean, maybe again you just get desensitized to seeing the corpses on the ground, you know, day after day after day. But my goodness, I mean, we don't all experience it, again, the trauma the same way. So I can just imagine being there and trying to help people, and yet you're trying to get all this documented. You're having other GIs and civilians and dignitaries, congressmen, and other to come in and see, you know, what the Nazis had wrought. And just anyway,
I mean, I guess you kind of answered your own question there, Mark. Is that there's that focus on the living, in that, you know, if the US Army are prioritizing a situation, they're going to be prioritizing working out the systems for assisting those that have survived, getting them the treatment they need, getting the doctors there. I suppose in that kind of binary sense of the old diagram of the do you let the train go over the one person on the tracks, or do you let it go over 10 persons on the tracks?
Right.
Lesser of two evil. The priority decision is to look after those that are alive and get all that sorted out. And I imagine, I mean, we know the strain that put on the Allies. We know that the summer of 1945, even going into 46, the pressure put on the DP camps, the food, all that process there that was not sorted out for months. So I suppose that's going on as well. There's an immediate focus on the living, and the dead will, I guess, have to wait. Yeah. But
well, it's
anyway.
Yeah, tragic that the Allies were put in this position to have to prioritize, you know, like that to begin with. But yeah, of course, I mean, thankfully, many of these prisoners, I mean, they were going to receive dignified burials, you know, later on, which is good. So the last couple of charts here, again, it kind of spoke to this kind of extrajudicial, you know, activity that was taken. The first just talks about, I think we very early on, we were discussing the death march and how some of those prisoners were asking for weapons, you know. So you've got one case here, an officer from the 80th Infantry Division, where they do actually end up giving weapons to some Russian POWs, like give them weapons and tell them, like, have at it. You know, it's basically, I can't think of the right hunting term right now, but like, you know, okay, it's free. I can't. Yeah, it's the term isn't coming.
Open season. Yeah.
Thank you. Exactly. Yes. It's okay.
And I'm from the country where it doesn't happen. Well, it does happen. Yeah. That's
Russian
the terminology you should know, Mark. You're the American.
Yeah, I should. Yeah, but like Russian POWs, hey, here's some weapons. Here's some clothing, you know, GI clothing for you to wear. It's open season if you see SS. The next, I think the one that you're on this is a GI from the 63rd Infantry Division, and he just talks about. Hey, we were still in combat. We didn't have time to go inside the camp, but as we passed along kind of the perimeter fence, you know, we could see prisoners inside basically drowning, you know, like one of the German guards in a horse trough. And And the interviewer says, okay, well, how'd you react to that? Well, we were still in combat and I saw it happened and I wasn't going to intervene, not particularly inclined to intervene. And we just kind of went about our way. And I would suspect, I mean, a lot of this is not documented very well, but you can imagine, again, like put yourself in these liberators' shoes, especially in those first hours, maybe even the first couple of days, just the kind of things that you just kind of look the other way, right?
Yeah, well, I urge anyone who hasn't seen it already to watch the show we did with my friend Edward about the liberation of Belsen. The poor pressures those 24 British soldiers are put under in those first few hours there, just absolutely horrific. This macabre carnival of events happening around them that they had really little control over. And it came up in the sidebar earlier about clearly on some level, if an SS guard is shot by an Allied soldier during the process of liberation, that's a war crime on some level. We're not saying it isn't, but there's a spectrum. There's that a judge would look at these situations. It's why we have premeditated murder, we have manslaughter, we have all these different grades. Yep. It's not as binary. But yeah,
exactly.
Who would want to be in that situation of trying to manage this situation? I mean, to say emotions would be running high is doesn't get anywhere near to cutting it.
Yeah, and I think what Henry Taylor in that book excerpt I read, I think touches upon that a little bit. But yeah, I mean, just the disease, the starvation. I mean, people seeking vengeance. I mean, and it's all happening at the same time, and you're expected to go in there. I mean, these various liberating units and try to impose some sort of control, right? Some sort of stability, while at the same time recognizing that, again, I mean, just given what these prisoners had gone through, how do you kind of enable them to? Well, I guess Vince is putting it very lightly, but there are two more charts here. Again on the extrajudicial piece. This is actually from the same article. If anybody wants to go back and read it, it was in the Washington Post, the 24th of July, 2005. And the first one is from Ben. Forgive me, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Ben Ferink. Sorry. Somebody probably knows how to pronounce that. But basically, you know who he is, right? So Ben Ferink. He was the last Nuremberg prosecutor. Living. He just passed away a couple of years ago. After he left the army in 1945, he became the lead prosecutor for the Einsatzgruppen trials in Nuremberg. Was able to secure a number of convictions. Great thing. Glad that he did that. He also became a real kind of powerhouse, spearheading the establishment of the International Criminal Court later in his life. But again, he faces one of these moral conundrums. So you see here at the very top of the slide, he talks about where it says, someone who was not there could never really grasp how unreal the situation was. I once saw DPs beat an SS man and then strap him to the steel gurney of a crematorium. They slid him in the oven, turned on the heat and took him back out, beat him again and put him back in until he was burned alive. I did nothing to stop it. I suppose I could have brandished my weapon or shot in the air, but I was not inclined to do so. Does that make me an accomplice to murder, right? So again, just one example. And then the final one we have here, it's from the same article. And this is Arnold Weiss, who had been an officer with a U.S. Army counterintelligence unit, native German, so obviously fluent in German, and was involved in trying to determine what had happened to Hitler at the end of the war. So that's kind of an interesting side story we won't get into. But he's interrogating a lot of these concentration camp personnel, a lot of the higher ups. I think he's also involved in actually finding discovering Hitler's last will and testament. So really fascinating guy. But anyway, he talks about how they were handling some of these German prisoners, like the lower level ones. So basically, he says that they'd go through the interrogation and they would confirm beyond the shadow of a doubt, these counterintelligence interrogators, like confirm beyond the shadow of a doubt, yes, this person is admitting to having been a part of the camp system. Yes, they written down basically, admitting to the fact, signing at the whole, all the everything. So admitting they were part of all this. And so a lot of these counterintelligence officers, a lot, that's a relative number, but more than a few, right? They conclude that, hey, a lot of these are lower level functionaries, right? These are not the camp. It's not the camp commandant, or it's not, as we were talking about before, I was at Nuremberg, not a higher up, not in a leadership position. So, but they know these are bad people. They've admitted to being part of all this, you know, accomplice to murders and everything. So, yeah, it's interesting here where once they got a signed confession, once the interrogation was done, on more than one occasion, they would get basically a kind of a head nod or a wink from a counterintelligence officer in charge. They would then put these lower level concentration camp personnel in a Jeep. These guys would have no idea where they were going. They would drive them out to a facility where DPs were being kept. And I'll just read one little passage here where, so again, this is Arnold Weiss. He says, Weiss remembers the panic in the SS man's eyes when they finally realized where they were being taken. We never told them where they were going, he says. At the sight of the old German army barracks, they grasped their fate. Some would try to cling to the Jeep, but the reception committee would forcibly remove them. Weiss says he never looked back in the rearview mirror to see what happened next, nor did he need to. And he says a little bit further down, he never had any moral qualms about his actions. I never had much thought after the war. The point is, what do you do with these guys? The war crimes courts were already backlogged with your Nazis. The jails were full. They were going to slip through the cracks, right? So that was a way, right, of handling accountability for. Okay, then continuing on, yeah, we've got some statistics. Again, and this can come across as quite, I think it's in maybe the next slide. Yeah, so these are provided by the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And as they stated, and as we know, we're never going to know, even despite the fact that the Nazis were documenting this genocide as well as they were, we'll never have completely accurate 100% numbers. So many of these are just estimates, but these do come from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And one thing that they state about these numbers is that, and I'll just read it here. They say counting victims is important for research and to understand the magnitude of the crimes. The magnitude is clear, and behind each number are individuals whose hopes and dreams were destroyed. Efforts to name the victims are important to restore the individuality and dignity their killers sought to destroy, right? And so here you can see in totality, the death toll from the Holocaust and from Nazi persecution, right? With Jews there at the top and a whole variety of others as well. I think, Paul, I think 90% of all Jews in Poland are murdered. I think it's 2/3 of all Jews in Europe are murdered. Just it's almost unfathomable. I mean, you look at this, they're just numbers. It seems abstract, but as the Holocaust Memorial Museum says, behind every number, right, was an individual, families, hopes and dreams, career, a future, right, all smashed and eliminated by the Nazis. Pardon me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Next slide. Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of put this in perspective. So sadly, there were a number of genocides and mass death events that precede the Holocaust. And sadly, there are many others that come after the Holocaust. So sadly, it is not a one-off event. It's not new. We have ongoing mass death events. And of course, there's some debate as to whether or not some of those mass death events are genocides. But these are ongoing, as we speak. And as you look at this, we start with basically the Spanish conquest, like all the way back to 1492, and I brought it all the way forward to Rwanda. And again, you can think of some of the instances that are sadly occurring, as we speak now. But one thing that jumps out to me is that we see that these genocides and/or mass death events, they are not unique to any race. They are not unique to any religion. They are not unique to any region, right? So again, just going forward, whatever we can try to do within reason, within the realm of possibility to try to forestall and prevent these events from occurring again. We've got all the evidence. We know, again, what the consequences are. And I want to be optimistic. I want to say that there's never going to be another one again, right? But
well,
history,
yeah, I mean, I want to add the comment that whenever I understand there are legitimate reasons to debate whether or not some of these more recent events are genocide or not, or whether they're. But the fact is, if I was a relative of someone who'd been killed, I would find the argument about whether or not that person was officially part of a genocide or not a bit of a moot argument, really. It's like the Americans who died in the Korean War, someone saying, but it wasn't a war, it was a police action. Your husband still come back in a box under a flag, though. The label of the event makes very little difference to the death of the individual. So I on the one hand, I understand why we can't start throwing some of these terms around willy-nilly. I'm very uncomfortable about us throwing the word Nazi around anybody we don't like. That's a dangerous precedent. But there also are times when we can clearly see that there are Nazis around today, and that label does apply to them perfectly. But yeah, a death is a death, and whether or not that person is officially dying in an atrocity or a genocide or not makes very little difference to the dead person themselves and that dead person. I want to make that little point there because I think it's pertinent. But yeah, it is a sad fact that humans are continuing to be shitty to each other, unfortunately.
Yeah, and to be clear, I wouldn't necessarily classify all these as genocides. That's why I use the term mass death there, kind of through that caveat in as well. And certainly there are many more examples that we could have included here, although this is probably more than enough, I think, to to make the point. But that's why I think it's so important. I mean, to continue to document this. I mean, whether it's in courts of law, museums, for us to continue to talk about these kinds of things, to do whatever we can, like I said, within our power, to try to prevent it from happening again, and to remember those who sadly perished, as a result of the banality of evil at the hands of others. And
let's leave it with your excerpts, and then we'll bring this to an end. As amazing as it's been, it will have to end. So
you're being too kind, but
I knew it would be a long one and an important one. But
and thank you so much for indulging me and continuing this on for as long as you have. And again, for all the audience, thank you so much for being a part of this. And I can't wait to go back and read the chat, because I'm always learning, and I'm sure there will be all kinds of things in there that will help improve my understanding of this particular event. Last thing we're looking at here are just some excerpts from Gustav Gilbert's Nuremberg Diary. Probably many of you are familiar with who he was. He was the lead American military psychologist at Nuremberg, if I try to pronounce it like a German would, Nuremberg. And so he's having one-on-one discussions. I mean, he's going in and doing Rorschach tests and IQ tests and talking at length, with, just the worst of the worst, right? I mean, we could go on kind of the litany of Ribbentrop and Goering and all the rest, right? Streicher. So he gets to know them pretty well, has lengthy conversations, trying to understand why they did what they did. And so I think this kind of brings us forward. I mean, this is text out of a book that was published in 1947, and it's been republished since then. Book again is called Nuremberg Diary, where he literally took verbatim text of discussions and notes he was making and put it in this book. So here he is in 1947, again reiterating discussions he'd had with some of the just the worst of humanity, right? Who'd been leading the Third Reich between 33 and 45. So the first piece here comes from a discussion that Gilbert was having with Goering. So Goering starts off by saying, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Gilbert comes back and responds and says, there is one difference, I pointed out. In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter through their elected representatives. And in the United States, only Congress can declare war. And then Goering responds to Gilbert's comments or statement and says, oh, that's all well and good, but voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. And then finally, we've got a quote here from Fritz Wieshofer, who was an aide, for lack of a better term, to Baldur von Schirach, who initially led the Hitler Youth from 31 to 40. Then he serves briefly in the campaign in France, and then he becomes the Gauleiter of Vienna. So he is responsible for sending tens of thousands of Viennese Jews to their deaths in concentration camps. And in fact, he gets 20 years in prison at Nuremberg. So Wieshofer says, I am amazed to hear American officers, and he's saying this in 1946, I am amazed to hear American officers express anti-Semitic sentiments even now. Hasn't the world learned anything from Germany's horrible example? How can there still be anti-Semites after what has happened in Germany? Of course, there are some who may say that they never realized before what racial prejudice can lead to. But now, after Auschwitz, as von Schirach says, German youth certainly learned its lesson. It is quite right, as he puts it here, what Hitler has done to both the Jewish and the German people. We have learned in bitterness and misery what racial prejudice leads to. But hasn't the rest of the world learned yet?
Wow.
And that's it.
That's those quotes there were very timely, and you know, what's the old adage? We're not learning from the past, unfortunately. But well, some of us are, and some people aren't. But we will. I mean, it's been an absolute tour de force, Mark. And yeah, there was kind of a bit in the middle where the kind of the sidebar got a bit muted because I think they were just processing, you know, the information, but the conversations kind of got more lively again towards the end. But yeah, absolutely fantastic and timely and important presentation. So folks, I'm back in tomorrow. Neil Cherry is on with a slightly lighter show where we're talking about the myths surrounding the Battle of Arnhem. Neil has been absolutely chomping at the bit to do this one and debunk some of the ridiculous things said about the Battle of Arnhem. So that'll be a slightly lighter one tomorrow. And then we have 2 on Friday. Steve Clay is doing the final part of his presentations about the First Division in Europe. So that's the move into Czechoslovakia in April and May 1945. And we've got more stuff coming your way. But as always, click like and subscribe. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, viewers, for your questions, descriptions, and links to the Patreon, etc. in the links below. I will see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.